Hi there, I'm Sarah Bratt from Syracuse University, and this is a presentation that was given at the ASIST Annual Meeting 2018. The co-authors are Jen Chin and Jeff Hemsley, both professors at the Syracuse University iSchool. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about multidimensional metadata. Originally, this presentation was given for the Big Metadata Analytics workshop at the ASIST Annual Conference. And right now I'm going to go through the main slides and also wrap up with some of the discussions that we had at the finale. So the title is Using Multidimensional Metadata to Conduct Systematic, Exploratory, Big Scientific Metadata Analysis. Bit of a mouthful, but hang with me. So our team is the Metadata Lab at Syracuse University, and we study a wide range of topics related to metadata, but we have two focus areas. So the first one is big metadata analytics. And for the most part, we focused on using the trace data, primarily the metadata, from the scientific data repository GenBank from the National Center for Bioinformatics Information. And the second topic is metadata modeling and linking. So this looks more at metadata standards. But today, we are just going to focus on big metadata analytics and have a case example at the very end of this presentation to display what we mean exactly by a big metadata analytics project. So in a previous paper by Chin Costa et al. In 2016, I believe it was, we identified some of the challenges that are associated with big metadata analytics. So the first challenge is that the data is large and it's computationally expensive. For example, you're doing inner joins across a relational database of up to 83 million rows and 15 columns. Second, big metadata analytics is going to require technical know-how. Python, MySQL, Ubuntu are the primary tools that you need for not only the database administration, but also the analytics and the documentation pieces of the workflow. Another challenge that we found is the data is messy and it's unstructured. Many of these columns are full of journal titles, for example, that are not validated through the form through which they were input. Also, the data is messy in the sense that author name disambiguation is still an area of growing focus in scientometrics research. So for example, author name disambiguation can inflate your results or can underrepresent your results. And further, we have maintenance. So a difficulty that we've encountered is acquiring updated data is quite challenging. So GenBank, which is our case example, adds data every 24 hours from international repositories. So it's difficult to maintain this data even when it's not streaming, but just a matter of adding additional records on a 24-hour cycle. And finally, it requires domain knowledge. So our particular example is using molecular biology, which requires a depth of knowledge across the specializations, which are numerous in molecular biology. So you need to have an expert on your team. In our case, it required many qualitative interviews to ascertain what our findings were and if we were interpreting them correctly. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but first I want to talk about the types of problems these challenges are that we just discussed. So the idea here is that if we identify the type of problem, it can help us identify the potential solutions. Pretty simple. So we've identified three types of challenges that appear in big metadata analytics. And the first one is a particularly intractable one. So the first one is computational. There are hardware and software challenges when you're manipulating big data, similarly when you are manipulating big metadata. The second type of challenge is conceptual. So once we move past the computational difficulties of acquiring and maintaining the hardware and software that will play nicely together and play with big data, you need to then establish workflows. The workflows and the research group data and document management help to create non-redundancy, and this way we are not reinventing the wheel. every time we have a new, for example, network analysis. There is a workflow, there is code and documentation that allows us to proceed through the analysis with consistency and reproducibility. Finally, policies and governance. This is a type of challenge, type of problem that's distinct from the other two in the sense that it is also socio-technical. It requires us to look at the metadata standards for the input of metadata. For example, librarians at the National Institute of Health will create metadata categories that best capture the data that's input into GeneBank. And these metadata categories are generated from describing the sequence data as well as the documents associated with that sequence data. And underneath policies and governance, there's also incentives. You need folks to submit their data to these repositories so that we have a rich content of metadata. So there's some incentives out there in the policy and governance realm that are incentives for open science. So we actually have participation and community capacity contributing to these massive data repositories. So just for today, we're going to focus on conceptual and also a little bit on policies and governance right at the end. Okay, so a status update on big metadata analytics. From doing some previous, some literature review and also the empirical studies in big data, in bibliometrics, and in data science around primarily big data for industry, we have a status update on sort of the state of big metadata analytics. So first of all, there are these three pieces that are pretty well known to the big metadata analytics community. So the first one is, we know the platforms of interest. We've identified them, and many have done empirical studies. For example, Twitter is one platform that many studies have been conducted on and could be considered big metadata analytics. Some examples of this are seeing how universal basic income conversations have evolved. Jeff Hemsley conducted this study about a year ago in 2017 with collaborators at the iSchool. And what usually is done is you collect the big metadata from Twitter and you see what are the trends, what are the distributions, and sort of how the data is shaped using the metadata, describing the tweets. Another platform that has been of interest in big metadata analytics has been these large scientific data repositories. GeneBank is one example. Another in the social sciences is ICPSR, which is the International Consortium for Political and Social Science Research. I might have to double check on that acronym. ICPSR is the area you should check out if you want to look it up. So this is of interest to science and policy makers, science and public policy makers who aim for data-driven policy. So in this first point, we have identified the platforms and we know that they are of interest for those who are trying to make policy and who aim to create a data-driven policy. Second, we also aim for reproducibility and transparency. If you're writing a report to inform policy, whether public or science, it's important to have a clarity of what are the findings, what is the sort of consensus around your findings in order to communicate with those groups. And finally, we know we have a massive amount of data. We know that we have been able to wrangle it, to pull it down from these, whether web servers or other types of file storage formats. And we have a vague sense of the schema, how these records are related, and the amount of time that they span. And we also have an intuition that these platforms, this massive amount of data, is a research gold mine. However, the tricky part is, and sort of the unknown part is, how do we develop systematic approaches for dealing with this massive metadata from these relatively unstructured sources? How can we identify easily, systematically, reproducibly, transparently, which are relevant, which columns are clean, what are the contents, and are they consistent over the time period that they have been contributed? And how can we start the exploratory analysis with this consistency, with these systematic approaches? So the problem that we identify in this paper is that there is a lack of systematic big metadata analytics approaches. again, there's this lack of systematic approaches to the open science data repositories, and that is a specific area that we're focusing in. We've observed through our own work and through the literature review that these studies are often based on ad hoc approaches. These ad hoc approaches are often inconsistent and can result in, so to speak, reinventing the wheel. And so this challenge impacts the reproducibility and the transparency of big metadata analytics research, and in addition, threaten the sustainability of big metadata analytics as a scholarly community that can build from these disparate research communities to come together and to inform science policy. So in order to inform science policy and public policy that is data-driven, we need consistent and systematic ways of analyzing metadata. So our findings. First of all, we found a very rich source of theoretical sort of structure in John W. Tukey, who wrote a book called Exploratory Data Analysis in 1977. Now, big metadata analytics often begin with exploratory data analysis. And so Tukey calls this exploratory data analysis as detective work. It is a matter of identifying the aspects of the schema of your data that are of interest and proceeding through them in a systematic way that allow you to build hypotheses and pull upon traditional frequentist and also Bayesian statistical methods to make your claims and to substantiate them or to run them, at least to test them with big metadata. So Tukey says, what does it mean to feel what the data are like? So this is the part of exploratory data analysis that really allows us to look at our data in the exploratory phase and kind of feel it out in a systematic way. He identifies that we can look at appearances of separation into groups. We can also look at where are the values centered. We can see where there are unexpectedly popular or unpopular values, as well as the distribution or the spread of the values. So we take Tukey and we say we're going to mash up Tukey and this exploratory approach with traditional metadata standards literature. So in the standards literature, Chin et al. Look at metadata requirements in a 2012 paper. Specifically, they identify an architectural view as well as a functional view applied to the problem of systematic detective work. So what we say here is that in the systematic sort of detective work approach that Tukey advises, we can bring together this detective work, this exploratory analysis, with the functional and architectural requirements of metadata. So we can ask, through this framework, what can we use as clues in the detective work of big metadata analytics? And if we want to look at metadata for scientific open data repositories in the exploratory phase, we can look at this model that you see here. So this model is the architectural view of metadata requirements. It includes identity metadata. One example of this is the authors or agents, as well as investigation, the publication, and the dataset or collection. So as you can see also, there's another category called semantic metadata. Semantic metadata include taxonomy, thesauri, classification, ontology, and relations. We also have the scientific context as an architectural requirement. These are sometimes the workflow or the provenance of how the data were created. And those are included as parameters or aspects of processing. Another piece is geospatial metadata, as well as temporal metadata, and this category of miscellany that kind of allows us to include whatever domain specifics are within this architectural view of requirements. So in this model, the architectural view, we see metadata as, quote, building blocks that form a comprehensive representation of data or information objects. All right, so we've gone over exploratory data analysis as a way into the data, as a way to see what is our schema, what are the interesting variables in this sort of unrepresented large-scale metadata. And we've also looked at the architectural and functional requirements in a model of the requirements for metadata, and we're going to mash them up now as a way into addressing this challenge of unsystematic big metadata analytics. So the best way to ground this, I think, would be in a use case. So here we have an example of mapping the architectural requirements over to GenBank. So here are some functional and architectural metadata dimensions in NCBI's GenBank. All right, so first you can see there is identity metadata. Now, identity metadata, again, is authors, is agents, publications. So what we have in NCBI are publication title, as well as the affiliation of the institution. These are type of identity metadata. Already we can see that we've covered at least a piece of the architecture of our big metadata. We've got the identity metadata. But we can also see from this model that we are missing some pieces, and so it would be logical to proceed through the metadata by looking for these categories. For example, we can look at semantic metadata. We do have a taxonomy that we also pulled into the GenBank extant metadata that allows us, it was a mashup within our analytic process. So here we can see taxonomy, which includes organisms, which includes various levels of the environmental samples that were used for a sequence in the repository. Another category that we have is geospatial. So for example, geospatial metadata, we have the location of the sample. We have the location of the institution that is associated with the submission. Another piece is temporal metadata. Now the granularity is going to vary depending on the sort of collection methods, but here in this example we have the year of the submission as well as to the day and month that it was submitted. And finally we have this miscellany. So this is often a category that can allow for some flexibility within your analysis because it can look at the domain of interest and identify that extra piece. For NCBI's GenBank, the miscellany category, for example, is the type of data sequence. This kind of falls under semantic metadata because, as you'll see, the taxonomy is a type of semantic metadata under the tree of life, so to speak, taxonomy. But specific to GenBank, there's type of data sequence, for example, mammal, rodent, bacteria. This kind of ontology made sense for this particular scientific community, and so that's why it's included in the miscellany category. Okay, so here's a look under the hood. We have the GenBank flat file format here on your right. Here's the locus, which is a way of identifying the metadata submission. We also have definition, which is defining the organism or sample that has been submitted, and a number of other metadata pieces. So each of these metadata pieces will map to our architectural and functional requirements for metadata, allowing us to see how much of the picture we have at our disposal for an analytic, for our analytics. Now you might be thinking, there are already systematic ways of investigating metadata, and indeed of big data. And these are called data dictionaries, and these are called metadata standards. So it's true, we do have systematic ways of approaching big metadata. And librarians, for example, will curate very detailed data dictionaries using controlled vocabularies that allow us to understand the data in a systematic way before we enter into our analysis. But often these metadata and data dictionaries are not comprehensive, and they do not anticipate some of the analytics that unfold from us proceeding through the exploratory phase. So I'm going to show you an example from a timeline. Okay, so future work. There are two pieces of our future work. The first one is analytic, and the second one is more along the workflow and systematizing big metadata analytics. So the first one is looking at statistical properties of networks as defined by several dimensions of the functional and architectural requirements for metadata. So the first one is by organism. This is a way of coming at community detection that is an alternative or a complement to traditional approaches to community detection in computer science and scientometrics. So traditionally in scientometrics, we've defined a community often by the network flow. This is a structural view of how communities cluster together. And another one is link density. So we can define a community based on the density of links and relations as defined by, for example, co-authorship on a publication or co-authorship on a patent. So some other approaches that we can take to analyzing the statistical properties of networks defined by the same relations, for example, co-authorship on a publication or a patent, are to look at them in this a priori way, to look at them from the dimensions of big metadata analytics as defined by their identity properties and their semantic metadata requirement properties. For example, by organism, many scientific communities in molecular biology are organized around model organisms. This can be seen as reflected in the data repositories that appear on websites such as Yeast Genome and also Flybase. These communities have formed around their common background knowledge and use of the organisms such as the mouse and the Drosophilus melanogaster, I believe, it's Drosophila. The second is by institutional affiliation. Institutional affiliation is a type of semantic metadata. The third one is intersectoral research groups. So within the intersectoral research groups, such as private, public, university, government, we can see how expertise can organize to create a scientific output. The next piece of our future work is developing and testing computational and conceptual workflows. So based on a previous paper for ASIST 2017, we identified some of the requirements of computational and conceptual workflows. And our next step is going to be harmonizing the hardware, software, conceptual, and the management of our research group components of big metadata analytics in order to try out some of the current software tools such as Jupyter Notebook and see if we can create reproducible and transparent workflows using these tools. We also are going to look at Amazon Web Services and some of these AI and smart data dictionaries. So the idea behind a smart data dictionary or smart database, such as Amazon Web Service, is that the database will learn from the users interacting with it and restructure themselves in a smart way so that the queries are a little bit faster, so that the optimized sort of approach to analytics can leverage on not only human input, but also how the software can optimize on the previous queries that were put to it by the Science of Science researcher. And finally, we are going to look at the software that can instantiate these workflows. So Jupyter Notebook was one that we mentioned, and there's a feature in Jupyter Notebook that you can install a library which will push to GitHub in order to control for your version. So our final step will be to run some scripts and to create a comprehensive repository, as well as to house some of our exploratory analyses and on these dimensions of interest. So in this presentation, we looked at some approaches for systematizing big metadata analytics to address the problem of ad hoc analyses and to sort of create a richer framework for approaching scientific metadata analysis specifically, but also more generalizable to, for example, social media metadata analysis, which, like scientific metadata analysis, is also big. We used John Tukey and his approach to exploratory data analysis in addition to and sort of juxtaposed with the literature in functional and architectural requirements of metadata to allow us to see approaches for exploring in general metadata, in general big data contexts, as well as specific to metadata, to give us a better picture of the schema as well as relations between when we're approaching a big metadata analytic problem. We went through an example, a case example, and we talked a little bit about future plans. So thanks so much for listening and watching, and I hope to see you in the Big Metadata Analytic Sandbox and on GitHub soon. Thanks. So in this presentation, we talked about a systematic approach to big metadata analytics. We looked a little bit at some of the previous literature in exploratory data analysis from John Tukey. Then we looked at the bibliometrics research in architectural and functional requirements for metadata, and we brought them together, juxtaposed them to give us a more systematic way of creating reproducible, transparent research in big metadata analytics. Then we looked at a use case, specifically in a scientific data repository. The next steps are going to be creating some computational workflows, and I hope to see you on the Big Metadata Analytics Sandbox or in the future at the ASIST conference. Thanks.